Hi 12B, welcome to our first lesson of the picture of Dorian Gray. And as you will see from that outline that I posted yesterday, that we are going to just look at some of the general background to the Victorian era, and then we'll have a look at the first part of chapter 1. I'm really sorry that you haven't been able to hear one another's speeches. Maybe your friends would be willing to upload their speeches onto YouTube for you. That's up to them. But very briefly, the Victorian era runs from 1837 to 1901. And that really covers the time that Queen Victoria herself was on the throne. It was a very interesting period, particularly in English history. It encompasses the Industrial Revolution and a whole lot of scientific developments that had a huge influence on the way people saw their world. So if you think back, for example, to the Elizabethan era, everything in that era was related to their perception of the chain of being, that very set hierarchy of God at the top and then the king and the aristocracy, and so it went down. In the Victorian era, because of the scientific developments that were taking place, that world view started to change, and people started to realize that not everything that happened needed to be attributed to an act of God. If you remember, for example, in Macbeth, when Duncan is murdered, all the events that happen around that are interpreted as a reflection of the disturbance of the chain of being. So in the Victorian era, people had a more scientific understanding of their world, and as a result of that, they also started to question the religious views of the day. And this led to a society full of contradiction. On the one hand, under Victoria, you had these very, very austere moral rules that were in place. You will have heard me mention before, for example, that homosexuality was seen as a crime, and Oscar Wilde himself spent time in prison as a result of his sexual orientation. There were all sorts of other crimes. Adultery was a crime that you could be sentenced to prison for. So on one level, you had these very, very strict rules, but on another, you had people questioning those rules, and so you landed up with a society that was very hypocritical in its nature. And we see a lot of that hypocrisy in the novel. Those scenes where we have the descriptions of the luncheons that Harry and Dorian Gray attend, and on occasion Basil attends, and we see this hypocrisy where on one hand we have these very strict rules, but on the other hand people are getting up to all sorts of mischief behind the scenes. We also see in the picture of Dorian Gray the social classes of the day. So with the Industrial Revolution and the French Revolution, those of you who do history will know something about that, we had the emergence of the bourgeoisie, or the middle class. Prior to that, of course, we had simply two classes, two structures of society. You had your aristocracy, and those were the people that held all the wealth and land in the country, and you had your peasantry. Those were the people who were entirely dependent on the aristocracy for their well-being. As the middle class started to emerge, you started to see a fairly large working class coming into being. And with that working class came other societal issues that started to be debated. And you have some reference to Parliament in this novel. For the first time, the monarch was not the sole executor of justice and law, and you had a Parliament who were starting to dictate justice and law. But the attitudes of your aristocracy remained very, very prejudiced. And we see that particularly in Lord Henry's attitude to the lower classes. He is very dismissive of them. To the aristocracy, the lower classes were almost subhuman and required no more thought than their servitude to the aristocracy. And we see them being very snobbish and dismissive and sometimes cruel to the lower classes. So as we work through the novel, you're going to see Henry's attitude in particular towards them. Think about, for example, his attitude towards Sybil Vane, especially after Dorian ends his relationship with her, and how cruel both Henry and Dorian are to her. You also see some of the descriptions of the areas in which the lower classes lived, the Blue Fields and so forth, Whitechapel. Those areas were really, really low class and where your poorer classes lived. On the other hand, you have Basil, who to some extent represents the middle class. He's working to make a living, and for the upper classes to actually be employed or have to earn your money was something that was completely infra-dig or unacceptable to them. They didn't work a day in their lives. They spent all their time going to soirees, as they are mentioned. They go to the club, they go to their various manors in the country, but certainly they did not work for their money. And we see as Dorian comes of age, he comes into a lot of money, and he too falls into the aristocracy. Whereas Basil is a working man. He earns his money as an artist. He is occasionally invited to dinners at the upper classes because of his prowess as an artist. But his attitude towards the lower classes is very different to that of Henry's, and we see that emerge as the novel progresses. So those are really just the general attitudes in the Victorian society. And then along with those developments, we had some changes in attitudes towards art and fashion. And you will have heard, for example, Henry referred to as a dandy. The men of the day were very fashion conscious, and they were very aware of what the trends were and the fashions were, and they dressed accordingly in the upper classes, of course. In addition to that, attitudes to art started to change, and those of you who take art as a subject will have done something of the different art eras. Those eras fall into the same category as the literary era, so whatever you've learnt in art pertains to this as well. But most importantly was the shift from art being a representative or representation rather of history. So up until this point, artistic creations were either portraits of well-known people of your aristocracy. You may have seen movies, for example, set in the Victorian era where you have these portraits, the family portraits of people lining the staircases, and those were commissioned by various artists as a record of the family tree and the family history. In addition to that, your art would have represented historical events. So any great battle would have been represented artistically as a record of what took place. During the Victorian era, the movement of aestheticism developed, and you can have a look at the front of your novels if you like. There's some definitions of aestheticism there. But really what aestheticism did for art was it changed the concept of the role of art in society, where it moved from simply representing an historical event to what became known as art for art's sake. And if you want a simple definition of aestheticism, that is it. Art exists simply for the sake of art, simply to create something beautiful. It doesn't have to have any historical reference at all. And so art started to move away from the historical representation to simple things of beauty. And you, in the opening chapter of this novel, you see the conversation that Henry and Basil have around art, and we'll explore that in a couple of moments. And then, along with the aesthetic movement, developed another movement that became known as hedonism, or hedonism, as I prefer to pronounce it. And hedonism is really a pursuit of pleasure without any thought or reference to consequence. So it really looks at a generation of people who saw that their highest aspiration in life was to pursue pleasure, and with that came sensational experience. So they weren't worried about morals, they weren't worried about consequence, who got hurt or didn't get hurt. It was simply a fulfillment of a desire. And you see that particularly in Dorian Gray. He's a hedonist, the absolute epitome of a hedonist. And he pursues all of these pleasures through his life as he becomes increasingly depraved. Particularly, you see it with his relationship with Sybil Vane, and the way that he perceives her, and the way that he treats her when she displeases him. So it's a really, really important concept in the novel. We'll explore that more when we get into chapter 2. There's actually a lovely, lovely definition and a very important quote that we'll explore in chapter 2. And then, of course, literature also changed in the Victorian era, and it is in this era that Gothic literature emerges. Now, for those of you who have been into horrors, any kind of horror movie, if you have read the Twilight series when you were a bit younger, anything to do with vampires and dark lords and that sort of thing, all of that is part of Gothic literature. And Oscar Wilde was a Gothic author. Linked with him, you also had the story of Frankenstein is a Gothic novel. Those of you who might have watched some of the animated movies, Hotel Transylvania, I think it's called, that's all Gothic literature. So it's important that you are aware of the elements of it, and you'll start to see them from chapter 2. You'll start to see those elements coming into play. So you will see on the notes that I've sent you the key elements. You have always the existence of some supernatural power. So those of you who are into DC Legends and Marvel comics, all of that, that's all Gothic literature. Batman, Superman, Captain America, all of those are Gothic characters because of their ability to have supernatural powers. Usually you have some sort of a dark setting, and if you have finished reading the novel, which I hope you have, you will see that the settings of the novel become increasingly darker as Dorian Gray himself becomes increasingly depraved.